So our third speaker today is Peter Klepec, who is an associate professor and research advisor here at the Institute. He specializes in a range of topics from contemporary philosophy, German idealism, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and has published on a range of thinkers from Kant, Hegel, Freud, Badiou, Lyotard, Agamben, Negri, and you said that you're currently working on mood and nightmares. That sounds fantastic. So Peter's talk today is called Psychoanalysis is Not Failosophy.
Yeah, thank you. So I roughly speak about 45, 50 minutes, if this is okay. It's not something I was working thoroughly. It's just a couple of notes, remarks on our topics, and it consists of 4 parts. We will see how it works. I hope it's not too far. So, philosophy. This is philosophy for teens, for instance, so you can see what it is about. This is a book that was published this year, just recently, a couple of months ago. So the very title of my lecture, Psychoanalysis is Not Philosophy, can cause some confusion because it is not clear what I am getting at. Let me start by saying that philosophy is the name for a certain therapeutic process that was recently invented to deal with the fact that our modern human life is full of failures and setbacks. Philosophy deals with this in a way that is diametrically opposed to psychoanalysis. Philosophy and the model it represents is a contemporary substitute for psychoanalysis, its rival and opponent, I would say. Up to a point, it even represents the triumph of religion in the sense that later Lacan gave it. As you know, for Lacan, religion aims to cure people so that they do not perceive what is going well. It is not perceive what is not going well, while psychoanalysis for him insists on what is not going well, on what is failure and what is symptom. And as you know, for Lacan, religion will eventually triumph over psychoanalysis. And while religion is based on interpretation and theology, for Lacan here, philosophy is much more superficial and much more New Age. It does not even interpret in proper sense of the word. For if there are failures, they are not symptoms. The philosophy does not see failures and failed actions, deeds, or slips of the tongue as symptoms, neither on an individual nor a social or systemic level. Failures just happen. They will happen without asking what they mean or what they point to. To put it more speculatively, failures as negativities are cancelled, abolished. They are simply accepted as some sort of facts of life. The imperative here is become yourself. Become the true version of yourself. Do not be such a wimp. Be more resilient. The show must go on, and you have to do your part, despite some failures and setbacks. That which does not kill you makes you stronger, as Nietzsche said famously. So, that is the message of philosophy, as we will see in more detail later. In retrospect, I would change somehow my title and add something as well. So, the title would be Psychoanalysis is Not Philosophy, but philosophy is neither. So, they are both not something that philosophy aims at. In my first part, I prepared some remarks on our title to be continued and on the intersection, encounter between philosophy and psychoanalysis, but I will shorten it very radically. I would just say that, in a way, saying psychoanalysis is not philosophy or philosophy, as you like it, presupposes an assumption that psychoanalysis is not just an X. It is not just any X, anything. So, and the list is very long and it goes from various things. So in a way, we are here there's a wager on the assumption that psychoanalysis still has much to offer and give in the future, hence to be continued in a way. This first part is somehow concentrated on the question of the negation, is not be entity, etc., etc. But I will, as I said, I will leave it out because it's not important. My main point here is that if psychoanalysis claims that it is not philosophy, it is primarily not philosophy understood as a worldview. That's my main point. It's very simple, very straightforward, but as we will see, eventually things get complicated somehow. Let us look briefly at how Freud treats the worldview Weltanschauung in his new lectures on the introduction to psychoanalysis, which were published in 1933. Already at first glance, the lecture on worldview stands out from the other lectures, where Freud somehow tackles with more psychoanalytic topics, and it seems surprisingly even that Freud devoted a separate and independent lecture on a Weltanschauung. Why? Why actually? As if he wanted somehow to point out that in all this political, historical, and personal turmoil he was at the time, any attempt to stabilize, to orient, to consolidate, simplify, and generalize what the worldview really is, in its very nature must be somehow thwarted or subverted. What is Weltanschauung anyway? Freud, and this is a little long quote, we will soon get through it. Freud says the following: the word itself is a typically German formation. And he said, Weltanschauung is, I am afraid, a specifically German concept, the translation of which into foreign languages might well raise difficulties. Worldview, conception du monde, etc. If I try to give you a definition of it, it is bound to seem clumsy to you. In my opinion, then, a Weltanschauung is an intellectual construction which solves all the problems of our existence uniformly on the basis of one overriding hypothesis, which, accordingly, leaves no question unanswered, and in which everything that interests us finds its fixed place. It will easily be understood that the possession of a Weltanschauung of this kind is among the ideal wishes of human beings. Believing in it, one can feel secure in life, one can know what to strive for, and how one can deal most expediently with one's emotions and interests. Very interesting definition, and we don't have time to go fully and deeply in it. So let us proceed quite quickly. What about psychoanalysis in relation to Weltanschauung? And here Freud is quite clearly. If that is the nature of a Weltanschauung, he says, the answer as regards psychoanalysis is made easy. As a specialist science, a branch of psychology, a depth psychology or psychology of the unconscious, it is quite unfit to construct a Weltanschauung of its own. It must accept the scientific one. But the Weltanschauung of science already departs noticeably from our definition. So, in these three last lines, many problems lie. So, Freud highlights that psychoanalysis is unfit to construct a Weltanschauung of its own. It must accept the scientific one, but the scientific one, the Weltanschauung of science, already depart noticeably from this definition. So, in a way, there are many passages in Freud where he distances himself from philosophy and especially from Weltanschauung. One of the passages is the following: I must confess that I am not at all partial to the fabrication of Weltanschauung. Such activities may be left to philosophers who avowedly find it impossible to make their journey through life without a Baedeker, which is a guide for tourists, of that kind to give them information on every subject. So, here we are somehow stuck with Weltanschauung. Even more, there's not only one Weltanschauung, there are more. So, and Freud sets a task to somehow position psychoanalysis versus philosophy, science, religion, as well as other Weltanschauungen here in this lecture. I'm sure you know roughly what Freud aims about, but what is interesting somehow is how he relates actually psychoanalysis in relation to philosophy, science, and religion. I would claim that in all three attempts he somehow fails. There are some problems that he somehow sweeps under the carpet, to say the least. So, as you know, here there's a very known passage. Freud distances himself from philosophy, which in opposition to science borders on illusion. Its shortcomings is that it seeks to fill the gaps it finds in the real world, etc., etc. And here comes this famous image of a philosopher as a nightcap in Heine that Mladen Dolar commented in Slovenian very extensively about. And as perhaps, I will not go into Freud's complex relation to philosophy. There's already mentioned Dolar's passage or a chapter on it, and there are 3 books of Paul Laurent, SAZU, etc., etc. So this is a huge topic. And Freud studied philosophy under Brentano, and in his work he mentions many philosophers, for instance, Kant, Brentano, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer, but also some minor figures which are today forgotten, Lipps, Hartmann, Weichinger, philosophy of as if, etc., etc. So, Freud distances himself from Weltanschauung à la philosophy, but he distances himself also from other Weltanschauungen, and it would be interesting to go into detail here, but I will not go, which are some typical, I would say, bourgeois scarecrows: anarchism, nihilism, Marxism, and Bolshevism. So, in a way, what we get here is a strange Freud, in a way. He's very harsh towards, anarchism, nihilism, etc., and somehow lenient or more lenient than ever, than before, or in other works, to religion, for instance. So he has some understanding even of religion, and he somehow shows that the horse that he's staking at is science. Science as relying on a classical definition of a truth, which lies in correspondence between object and thought, idea and the concept. So that's briefly the situation, and I will just recapitulate the end of the lecture that Freud ends in this manner. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me in conclusion to sum up what I had to say of the relation of psychoanalysis to the question of a Weltanschauung. Psychoanalysis, in my opinion, is incapable of creating a Weltanschauung of its own. Again, it does not need one. It is part of science and can adhere to the scientific Weltanschauung. So here's a somehow different emphasis in a way. Before he said it must, now it can. So just to remind you the details. This, however, scarcely deserves such a grandiloquent title, for it's not all comprehensive, it is too incomplete, and makes no claim to being self-contained and to the construction of systems, meaning science. Scientific thought is still very young among human beings. There are too many of the great problems which it has not yet been able to solve. Which ones? A Weltanschauung erected upon science has, so there's a Weltanschauung erected upon science. Science does not have one of its own, but there's somehow a Weltanschauung erected upon it. Apart from its emphasis on the real world, mainly negative traits, such as submission to the truth and rejection of illusions. Any of our fellow men who is dissatisfied with this state of things, who calls for more than this, for this momentary consolation, may look for it where he can find it. We shall not grudge it him, we cannot help him, but nor can we on his account think differently. Yes. So, as I understand Freud here, he's somehow doing what he himself described as a boiled kettle argument, in a way. This is typical boiled kettle argument, and boiled kettle argument should have, as every negation has, in Freud's opinion, written upon it, made in unconscious. So here's a symptom. Here's a symptom, and it has a threefold nature, I would argue. So, what is actually true? Does psychoanalysis have a worldview or does not have? Does it not need one? Or it must have one? If possible, it would have one of its own. Why it is not possible? Why does it borrow one from science? But modern science, and Freud knows it very well, needs no worldview. So, to speak of a worldview of science, as Freud occasionally does, he knows it's a very bizarre thing, because modern science functions and proceeds fundamentally differently from a worldview. And Freud knows this very well, because he constantly contrasts science with religion in precisely this sense. So, what is he aiming at? What is his spontaneous ideology, if I can say so? So, is this related to some ideas about science, the progress, enlightenment, etc.? Why he hastens to justify that science is still very young? Well, humans are very young in terms of geology, too. So, what's this argument about? Why is he so lenient to religion here? And what is then problematic about religion except the definition of truth, etc., etc.? So, and again, why multiple worldviews? Do they contradict each other? On what terms? On what basis? How can we choose? Do we must choose? Etc., etc. So many questions are here, and I would claim that somehow we have a symptom which has a threefold nature here in Freud. But to simplify things a little, I would claim that as far as philosophy is concerned, Freud tends to reject it precisely insofar philosophy functions somehow a prioristic, somehow by rote, somehow that reminds worldview. Because if Freud would take philosophy seriously, he would immediately recognize that the first gesture of philosophy always, or philosophy worthy of its name, was somehow in the rejection of a worldview, you know. Philosophy begins since Plato with its distancing from opinion, distancing from myth, and from worldview in a broad, non-philosophical, generally understandable sense. So, if we take philosophers worthy of their name, they do not rest upon some worldviews. They might have some very general thesis, but, you know, worldview is rather a machine that eats everything. And if he somehow, indirectly via Heine, points to Hegel, he couldn't be in more agreement with Hegel, because Hegel, you know, has its own categories to describe worldviews, etc., as we will see later, too. And, you know, for Hegel, there's abstract thinking and the difference with his philosophy, which rests on a concrete totality, concrete absolute, etc., etc. So, although Freud, again, mentions the German origin of the word, Weltanschauung, which is quite strange, you know. The word Anschauung means intuition, and, you know, one never really understands what's this intuition, I would say. But the term Weltanschauung has its own historical context and its own history, philosophical history too. This context, I would argue, goes back much further than the very invention of the word Weltanschauung implies. As I said, the first gesture of philosophy is the attempt to distinguish and counteract myth. Yet, the problem is that mythos and logos will always remain intertwined, at least much more than philosophy itself would like. With the advent of modern philosophy, Descartes, etc., another problems arrived. And what is so important is that the very word Anschauung was invented after the French Revolution. So, at the rupture between 18th and 19th century, it came in its use. So, the word Weltanschauung was invented when the old world of the Ancien regime, the old order, was turned upside down and revolutionized. This connection should not be neglected, and it is a fact that the term was also coined by the Romantics as a reaction to the revolution. Schleiermacher, for example, in his speeches on religion or belief from 1813, presented the worldview as a totality of influences. Later, Dilthey defined Weltanschauung as a comprehensive view of our own place in the world. In the most general sense, Freud is right that the worldview attempts to fill in the gaps we find in the real world. The irony is that the addressee of his critique is none other than Hegel, indirectly, who was himself not only a harsh critic of Schleiermacher and Romanticism, but also a thinker of contradiction, of failures, and of dialectics. Hegel accuses Romanticism many things, but above all, to paraphrase him, that all cows are black in the night, and that it is ready to plunge all differences and all contradictions into the same black abyss. Practically, we have the same vocabulary as in Freud. Romanticism is accused of filling in the gaps it finds in the real world. So, we should not forget another threat of Weltanschauung, already presented in Schleiermacher in a way, because in worldview, world appears as a kind of conspiracy, as a plot. So today, we have not gotten rid of worldview. We have, the rise of conspiracy theories. I think that some other things are also related to that are worth mentioning. So how are you doing? Okay? Yeah? Right. The topics that Jelica yesterday mentioned, the topic of orientation or disorientation, surprisingly comes up with those philosophers who have particularly understood themselves in the terms of rupture, break, such as Descartes, Kant, Heidegger, and today Badiou. In particular this philosopher, we are dealing the issue of orientation. What does it mean to orient oneself in thinking is the title of one of the essays of Kant. Let me remind you on the Descartes' rules of provisional morality in this context, on the early Kant writing on this question of orientation and relying on the sense. Let me remind you of Heidegger, who is constantly somewhere lost in the fieldways, forest paths, etc., etc. So, let me remind you on Badiou's thesis on the disorientation of our times, So, here we have basically, we all have to do with the theme of a worldview, but in an indirect way. So there's a question of guidance. This is a quite complex topic. I wouldn't go into too deep into it, but I would just perhaps remark that it concerns a particularly complex relationship of philosophy to the theological. So this is a theological topic par excellence in a way, or orientations. You little sheep are lost, so in Christ. And it's also a political topic as well, especially in Badiou. And there are different interpretations of let's say, provisional morality in Descartes. I think Mladen wrote something about 40 years ago as a model of how ideology functions in Althusser, you know. And Ruda and Badiou wrote recently on the provisional morality from diametrically opposed position. So here we also would have to mention the question of the revolution or the missing revolution, fail better, etc., messianism, catastrophism, and finally we would come to the topic that I'm working now at the moment, so mood of nightmare as our contemporary predicament. So, when Theodor Adorno, for instance, demands that philosophy simply liquidates the worldview in his lectures on the terminology, I think, I would say that things are far more complicated than that. It's not a question of simple liquidation. We cannot simply liquidate worldview, and it's particularly telling that those philosophers who try to do that and relied especially on the science somehow compensate this move rather more intimately, privately, relying on various sorts of, let's say, Eastern Buddhist religions, you know, wisdom in a way. So somehow we have this paradox, you know, we have the most pure thought or subject, if I can say so, but a supplement is needed, supplement which comes in the form of a fantasy, as always, in a way. So, another thing that should be mentioned here is that Freud is against the worldview because not only fills in all the gaps, but because it is too quick. As Alenka Zupancic developed in one of her texts in Slovene, this is the procedure of over-understanding, when something, a thesis, an object, is too quickly understood, over-understood. So, psychoanalysis for Freud does not have to draw conclusions too fast, too hasty, because the world, as we would like to say, is full of surprises. Weltanschauung is made to interpret and to tame surprises, coincidences, failures, and contingencies that we constantly stumble across in our lives. The following motto of Freud serves here as a counter poison, let's say. Ça n'empêche pas d'exister. This is, you know, the theory is good, but the fact is here. So what do you do about it? So it refers to Freud's attitude towards the contingency of the empirical material over which psychoanalysis as a cure stumbles all the time. Hence, Freud's strong adherence to what he calls a scientific worldview, which would be better if we would understood it as a method of modern science, which is based on the empirical testing of hypotheses. Hypothesis non fingo, as Newton said. In contrast to wisdom and to worldview, which assume from the outset that there's an interpretative key to everything, psychoanalysis itself assumes that there is not such key at all, in a way. There's no key with a capital letter. There's also no compass that tells us where should we go, which path we should follow, and which direction or solution should we take, at least on the general level. The problem is on the singular level, that, at least for Lacan, there's a strange attractor that somehow disorients us, and this attractor is called objectia. And objectia appears for an individual as a singular corpus whose key definition is precisely that it confuses, confounds, disorients. So psychoanalysis goes together with a kind of a disorientation and not orientation, in a way. I would argue that renunciation of some sort of a general and universal compass or key is what is trying Freud to present here as the fundamental method of psychoanalysis, which it shares with science. But in difference with science, psychoanalysis nevertheless starts from scratch every time, because it fundamentally follows the logic of the individual case, the symptom, the failure, and starts from there. So this was yesterday talk about of today about metapsychology and study case. And we could say that in German there are two words for the case, for the example. In German there's a word der Fall, which means a singular case in the sense of Perry Mason, you know, a singular case of red parrot or red-headed woman, and Beispiel, which is more related to the method that usual science adopts. So in this case, we have an example and an instance of a universal rule, a law, a regularity, which has to be somehow confirmed or not, as in Popper, you know, falsified, etc. So, of course, there are also certain provisional classification in psychoanalysis, which the analyst decides with regard to the case he's dealing with, whether it's a neurosis, a psychosis, perversion, and chooses the appropriate technique for the treatment. But this too is achieved through the preparatory conversations that are necessary for the work of analysis to be operative and effective at all. So, the general idea that somehow psychoanalysis presents, and this is also presented in interpretation of dreams from the very beginning, despite sometimes Freud limits on his on thin ice sometimes, really. But in most of the cases, interpretation of dreams is based on the fact that there is no univocal translation from the latent to the manifest content of the dreams. The dream booklets are a fraud and a fake. There is no key, so as I said, and in this sense, psychoanalysis offers no guidelines or orientations in the sense that worldview or religion does. When it offers guidance, as we saw from the history of psychoanalysis in the form of ego psychology or American way of life, rather embarrassing and problematic things arise. So this is basically my argument, which could be backed up by also by some passages from Lacan. For instance, in Seminar 20, encore, Lacan says that the term worldview supposes a discourse, that of philosophy, that is entirely different from ours. And his lectures in North America, he says that I don't have the slightest conception of the world as they say. So this is not philosophy. He's not saying, as Lorenzo has shown, that the latest, Lacan somehow says, this is philosophy that I'm doing. So philosophy, understood as a worldview, is for Lacan very strictly the master's discourse, and that's it. So I'm skipping the various candidates that could be on the place of Failosophy. There are many candidates: Cellosophy, how to sell; Smellosophy, how to smell; Floatosophy, etc., etc. I would just remind you on a passage from Deleuze, from Difference in Repetition, where Deleuze is pointing out that the very name philosophy is wrong, because thought is primarily trespass and violence, the enemy, and nothing presupposes philosophy. Everything begins with misosophy, so with hating wisdom, with hating Sophia. Here we come to philosophy. Why philosophy in a way, and how, and in what context it does appear. I would say that the currently dominant ideology, the ideology of neoliberalism, I think neoliberalism is still dead in spite of being buried a couple of times. I mean, There's a book called Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism, which was written after the crisis 2008, which was basically the fault of neoliberalism, etc. And there's also a book, Never-Ending Nightmare, published in 2019, which also tackles with these questions. But, you know, it's debatable in which ways neoliberalism today survived. But for neoliberalism and for its ideology that it rests upon, everything is based on competition, and supposedly the best wins. Success is limited to a few, while the vast majority of the population are just failures, just expendable. And since there are simply too many failures, I would argue, there's an urgent need for therapies that do not question such a game. They do not question the system as such, but help to adapt, pacify, manage, and socialize an even larger part of the dysfunctional population. And philosophy is nothing original. It's just one of such books, as I will try to show very briefly. So, Failosophy is a project by journalist Elizabeth Day, who somehow at the introduction, How to Fail, Everything I've Ever Learned from Things Going Wrong, from 2019, introduced herself in the following manner. This is a book for everyone who has ever failed, which means it's a book for everyone. I don't have all the answers, in contrast to our worldview, and it's entirely possible I have none of them. But if you turn the final page having in some small worry recognized yourself and felt less alone, then that makes me happy. That means this book about failure is not in itself a failure. Does that mean I failed to write it properly? I hope not. So Elizabeth, who was born in England to English parents, from the book, this is basically a life story. From the book, we learned that she was born to English parents, spent her childhood and primary school years in Northern Ireland, and in this book, she simply describes her life as a series of failures, how she failed to fit into the environment where she was perceived by her peers as an outsider, English speaking in Northern Ireland, you know. Her father was an English surgeon, etc., etc. So she failed everywhere, as mentioned. She failed to stay in relationship, she failed to become a mother despite failed IVF procedures. She failed at her friends, she failed at jobs, she failed, you know, everywhere. So she invented a self-therapy to account for these failures and somehow to help others. So, does philosophy work, she asks in her first major success book. And she answers, yes, because I am not preaching a theoretical position. I have put 7 things I've learned into practice myself, so I know they worked for me. So we have something that openly recognizes that something is not theory, that it is practice. But this practice works only for one person, and it's not sure whether it will work for some other. So just to hint you at the problems. What is failure? Failure, she says, and I'm going to go quite fast. Failure is what happens when something doesn't go according to your plan. So, although failures makes us human, as she says, there are many quotes, so I won't quote every time. And although failure has happened to all of us, and it will continue to happen to all of us at various points of our lives, although your failures make you who you are, they do not define you. Failures do not define us. However, sometimes failure is not something to be avoided, she says. It is something to be actively pursued. Not only because we might become resilient to all kinds of troubles and failures, but also because she believes that failures are there for a reason. Even more, she convinces us the following. Try to believe that something good will come from a failure. So here's her list summing up what she believes, and I'm going quickly. First, failure just is. You're not your worst thoughts. Everyone feels like they've failed. Rejection is survivable. How to be a failure scientist? 6, there's no such thing as a future you. Being honest makes you stronger. So, failure, in the process of dealing with failure, what do you learn? I learned how to deal with it, and this had made me more, well, me. So here we have a typical ideology of our times of self-help books. It's nothing original in a way. Sometimes she just rests upon some other opinions, various monks, etc. For instance, there's a monk called Haymin who taught her that you don't have to torture yourself about failures or to be consumed by emotions because you are in control of your perceptions. You have the chance to process your feelings in a positive and healthy way. So, I won't go into etymology because she mentions Dutch words fale and pech, which fale is fate, which applies to common failures, failures which are repairable, failures you are failing at exam, but it's your fault because you should learn more. And pech in English is linked to the word pitch, which means dark or black. Terms could come to something which is beyond our power. So there are things that are beyond our power. So as I said, this is not a particularly original project in itself, but just one of many contemporary New Age approaches. Although they have nothing to do with psychoanalysis, hence the claim in the title, psychoanalysis is not philosophy, they largely take away its clientele, one would say, besides pharmacology too. Such and similar philosophies also deprive any critical theory and any philosophy worthy of its name of the role it could play in a contemporary society. We could say that such practices are just ideology and often associated with the popular philosophy, but they are bestsellers in a way, and they are somehow, how to put it, defining the field we are working in. One of the forms which is particularly suited for it, despite the very specialists that claim that it's surprisingly how Stoicism is used here, is Stoicism. And I will quote just from an interview of Eva Illouz with Martin Legros from 2022. I would quote you just the summarization of what is the problem. Eva Illouz is the author of Cold Intimacies, where she, wrongly or somehow erroneously criticizes psychoanalysis in her own work, but let's leave it. So she says, self-help thinking stems directly from the Stoics, the idea that we should change our representations of ourselves rather than change the world order. Being conscious of what does and what does not depend on us, the laws of nature to which we should conform. As I said, specialists are somehow critical if this is really Stoicism in its ancient version, but it's adopted for our contemporary uses. I'm continuing with the quote. All are inspired by Stoicism. How did age-old principles of resignation and detachments come to inspire such a huge trend in today's capitalist society that promotes success and self-accomplishments? Asked Illouz. Are the Stoics' ideas being purely and simply corrupted? Or is this ideological recycling? Where lies the continuity in the point of rupture between the two movements? What is the difference between what self-help reveals about the psychology of contemporary individuals, their needs and expectations, and the performance ideology that uses Stoicism to enslave us to the finalities of modern capitalism? As I said, there are many books relying on Stoics. For instance, authors at Sharon Diaz and Jane Capri are the bestsellers, Stay Positive with Marcus Aurelius. I read it. Stoic answers to life questioning that will help you gain a more positive mindset of life. No worries with Epictetus, no worries with Marcus Aurelius, On the Happiness of Life by Seneca, Peace by Seneca, etc., etc. So, such and similar projects as Failosophy have a double function. On the one hand, they address real problems, such as the problem of happiness in today's culture and society, the problem of what is failure or a social symptom today, but of course they distort, stultify, and trivialize them ideologically. If there is a task of philosophy, that is, philosophy that operates at the intersection of psychoanalysis and that is a task to demonstrate the broader and relevant philosophical context, and thus its social significance of the categories that counter these procedures. In this sense, philosophy is still, to use Althusser's words, the class struggle in theory, or to use Kant's word, battlefield. Since there's no space to go into further details, I would just give you a couple of notes that I found particularly relevant in this context. First, it is in a way true that happiness has become a commodity and marketed in the form of services, therapies, and products that appeal directly to the consumer's personality. The theme of happiness and well-being has also become a symbol of specific advertising discourses since the early 1920s. And the theme of happiness is still central to the promotion and fantasy sold by marketing strategies and advertising a century later, that is today. So, there is a certain role of this ideology, as I said, in the global rise of neoliberalism, but in a way, our task is also to show how civilization and its discontents are also present here. One of the tasks of philosophy today is to show the philosophical importance of failure as such. What does it mean to fail? Because to fail is always connected with the kind of perspective for the point of view, from which point of view something is failure and something is not. Furthermore, the task of philosophy to tarry with negative or with the real, as Alenka said, or with negative, as Hegel said, is also to show the importance and difference of other similar terms such as error, mistake, symptom, malfunction, dysfunction, breakdown, wrongness, flaw, bug, software virus, etc., etc. The fundamental question today is how we understand them and what they really mean. That is, how they are connected to what psychoanalysis defines as symptom, the real, etc. This task, in a way, has to be aware that there are, so to put it, levels. In a sense, there will always be a gap between dreams and realizations, plans and execution, project and results, desired and outcomes. To put it differently, there will always be some sort of alienation. It's quite human, and that's it. There's nothing we can do about it. But there's also another part that that we should be aware of, and this is a fantasy of the perfect mastery that has accompanied modern science from the beginning, from Descartes and Bacon, which was given additional impetus later by utilitarianism, Bentham, and later by behaviorism. Today, the illusory character of domination comes to the fore with artificial intelligence. So this is the battlefield now. Artificial intelligence, in a way, somehow presents itself, and this is a universal belief in a way, as a possibility of total domination, of total mastery. And if Lacan was particularly against philosophy as a worldview and philosophy as a mastery, ontology, etc., and if he was a harsh critic of mastery and harsh critic of the figure of the master, whom he always portrayed as an imposter, the task of philosophy and psychoanalysis today would be to show in the concrete in the concrete contemporary situation, the operative value of negativity as such. So in a way, we have just to continue what philosophy was doing already in the recent past. Let me remind you that in the 20th century philosophy, for instance, there are many ways how philosophy was emphasizing the categories of contingency, for instance, as in the form, for instance, in the central form of the central category of the event, which is prominent in Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Deleuze, Derrida, Badiou, etc. In the ways of thematizing malfunction in Being and Time, paragraph 15, 16, this is about it. Crack and failure in Deleuze, rupture in Bachelard, Althusser, even in Foucault, dissonance and negativity in Adorno. So we have to continue the work. Here we can be optimist or pessimist, it depends. It's to be continued, to be decided. An optimistic perspective, perhaps, for me comes in a form that as Lacanians, and we start from the fact that we humans are speaking beings in a way. And this is the first threat, the first feature of anti-philosophy for Badiou, for instance, to being somehow connected to the language turn, etc. But for Lacanians, that means that we do not control language, that it, in fact, governs us in the sense of us being spoken bait, and we are speaking beings, parlette. In this sense, I would say there's an optimistic, perhaps too optimistic way, there or not, there will always be a gap between the statement and what is said, between the annunciation and enunciated. Perhaps there will always be slips of the tongue. Perhaps there wouldn't be psychoanalysis to interpret them as such, but there will always be some sort of failures. If we are pessimists, then we must agree with Lacan that psychoanalysis is a historical formation and it might be vanquished by religion eventually. Even philosophy, critical philosophy, is not in a so safe position. I would say that philosophy as a critical theory is quite endangered in the recent situation, considering the funding of science and crisis of university, etc. So we will see. To be continued. Thank you.
Okay, we've got some time for some questions. Yeah, Paris.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, those quotes are wonderful, and I would be remiss if I didn't make the joke. I mean, you know, there's this famous Lacan statement about formalization from Encore, which is a bit unusual. Il faille de l'écriture s'assurer, which is usually interpreted, it would be necessary by writing to be assured, but of course could also mean, you know, falloir, you know, it fails by writing, to be assured by writing. And that applies perfectly in a completely different sense to that. She needs to assure herself through writing, but also she fails to assure herself through writing. So it's very nice. Anyway, but the point that I actually want to make, I mean, this is obviously a matter of reading, but I think it can be made quite well given what you've set out, right? Is that the problem ultimately is almost a misplaced problem with philosophy, Weltanschauung, apropos of science, with which you began a discussion of. And in particular, I mean, again, it's not like this is ever said explicitly, but if you look at the language that Lacan uses, even in a apparently unequivocal text like the second seminar, right, it's very curious that he delineates from the origin that the symbolic order is a universe and distinguishes it. You know, he's just talked about Poiré and so forth, and distinguishes it from a world, but then continues to talk about l'avènement du monde de la machine, and Le Monde symbolique, furthermore, right? And, you know, this is not explicit, but you could almost say that you can come to the conclusion that from the origin, the symbolic is a universe, but only at a given point in time does it become a world, namely with the world of a machine. So actually the dupe is that somehow science is not a Weltanschauung, but rather the truth is that it's the first true Weltanschauung, right? Or you could put it another way, it is the first andere Weltanschauungplatz, right? And so, or maybe not maybe it doesn't have the Anschauung, but it strongly has the Welt. And so, from that perspective, and this, you know, I mean, again, a matter of reading, right? The master's discourse is not the problem. It's the discourse of science as such, which makes, you know, il n'y a pas d'univers du discours, but at the same time, there is a universe of discourse, currently speaking. It's science. I mean, with it now, okay, sliding terms from world to universe, but you understand that, like, so that's a quite curious link, I think. I mean, let me leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this link. Yes, of course, as a reader of Poiret, Lacan is very well aware what's the difference between world, closed world, and the universe, which is infinite in a way. But as you put it, you know, there's a problem. But the very word Weltanschauung, you know, in German, Anschauung is something that is intuitive, you know. So you intuitively see it, you know, as a picture. And there's some critique by, you know, of course, Heidegger on the conception of the Weltbild, you know. The world is taken as a picture, so in a way. Lacan would add that the world is a fantasy in a way, so fantasy frames it in this way. Yes, in a way, philosophy is really not a problem in a way. Here we could agree with, you know, introduction to negotiations by Deleuze that philosophy is just a minor power, etc., in comparison with real powers in the world. But it still has some sort, or at least popular or ideological version of philosophy, which Deleuze would call state philosophy, fulfills its role in a contemporary world in a way. That was my point, considering philosophy. I mean, it's easy to make fun or to make jokes, you know, but, you know, the real problem is that if you seriously think about it, the philosophy is critical theory. The critical theory in the most noble sense of the word today is really endangered, you know, because there's less and less funding of it, you know. So that was my point. And Lacan, of course, is criticizing toti enenai conception from Aristotle, you know. What the essence, the definition of essence, what would be if you being would listen to me, philosopher. So I'm maître, this is his pun, my being and master. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I would actually like to know what would your interpretation be, why Freud, you know, in the beginning of the Weltanschauung lecture, right? He makes a distinction between a scientist that starts with the hypothesis that the Earth core is made out of soda, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And the other that is made out of that claims that the core of the Earth is made out of jam, right?
Jam,
so
yeah.
the marmelade theory, as Freud
Yeah.
puts it, right? So it's I would just like to know what do you think Freud's position would be? So in some sense he would identify with the first guy, right? With the one that claims that there is, like, it is possible to make a hypothesis that the Earth is made, I mean the Earth core is made out of soda, because this is naturally kind of possible, and because jam, right, is a product of human activities already and stuff like this. So, but I would just like to know that I think he has some strange sympathy towards the second guy, maybe this is not in the Weltanschauung. Maybe it's in another. Yeah, it's in another lecture, right? Yeah, it's in the lecture on oh, whatever.
It's somewhere else, but
Yeah, it's in the first,
I know.
but it kind of
Yeah.
he talks about science. So this is the relation. So he has some sympathy for this other guy, for the author of Marmelade Theory, right?
Maybe he'd like jam simply,
No, I mean,
or marmalade.
yeah, okay, well,
Maybe.
I'm trying to pose a serious question.
Okay, okay.
Despite the, it sounds like a joke, but it actually isn't. I mean, it's because when you end up, like today, right? If there is I think that people who claim that, of course, the Earth core is made out of whatever it's made of, I don't even know, actually, so, to be honest, of some kind of gas, right? But the problem is that not the Earth itself, but at this moment, like the Earth system is not made out of like Earth and the nature, but of oil actually, or the Earth system right now, the core of the Earth system is not something natural. I mean natural, but it's a product of human activities, of course, right, in the Anthropocene. So it's and the old kind of scientists are very hesitant to accept this idea, right? There are a lot of the old-fashioned geologists who claim that this is impossible. That of course this is not possible, that human activities could form the core of the Earth system, right? In this sense. So I was just wondering, because so the second guy, the author of the gem theory, the discussion that we had yesterday. So in the possibility of Schreber being the meta-psychologist par excellence, right? Isn't Schreber like the guy of this type that he claims that the core of Earth, he would be able to claim that this is something that is produced by God, whatever it is, whatever. Just so, yeah. The question is actually, so do you think that why would Freud sympathize with this guy in some sense? He says if we kind of reject him, we are in a way a bit. I mean, we're not acting honestly, and we're not. I mean, we're going too far by simply rejecting him.
So you're claiming that Freud would sympathize with the marmalade theory? Incidentally, yesterday or the day before, there was some news about cycles of the Earth. There's new theory that every 27 million years there are some huge changes, geological changes, which scientists cannot explain why. And there was a graph, explicitly proving that the time span is correct, yet they don't know why. Maybe it's because of soda, maybe it's because of the marmalade, I wouldn't know. But I would say that Freud as someone who had a fling with the science in a way, would rather accept something which would be more believable in a way, more believable, whereas in a way seeing is believing, right? So we have to somehow have proofs that our beliefs are right. And here, I think the problem of Glauben and Unglauben is very acute in a way. How do we accept things that couldn't be verified or experimented in a way? And this leads to, in various ways, I think it's connected with analysis of Schreber too, in a way. And it's connected with other things as well. For instance, how do you believe that Earth is not, that Earth is flat, for instance? This is also a very common belief in a way. So yes, I have to sleep on it a little. See you tomorrow. So Yeah, thank you.
There is a passage at the beginning of Future of an Illusion, right, where Freud makes the distinction between an illusion and a delusion.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he takes them in a temporal manner. So he says, I think the first example is like, there are current illusions that will have been delusions. An example is like Aristotle thinking that, you know, you can generate life out of vermin, right?
Yeah.
But then there's the interesting example about alchemy. And actually, alchemy is not retroactively a delusion because Freud says, and it's really bizarre, to be honest. I mean, that's the jam man writing for Freud. He says, quote unquote, alchemy retroactively doesn't prove to be, it cannot be proved to be a delusion because, quote unquote, today the transmutation of metals is possible. It ties in with your point, right?
Yes, this is the question he tackles by saying that science is still young. Now, so this is his belief that somehow, and perhaps this also proves why he's so adherent to scientific Weltanschauung. This is simply his belief that in the future science will find some, you know, what is his scientism way to tackle the disease, etc., etc. So maybe one day science will find out and disprove one of the soda marmalade dilemma. Yeah, thank you. That's it. Okay. Yeah, thank you.